Hi, I'm Zealing, and today I'm going to be doing a Shadows of the Galaxy early meta overview, specifically in preparation for Gen Con. Now, the tournaments at Gen Con are going to be some of the first really big tournaments for this game, where there's going to be a lot of top players in attendance, and then a lot of people are going to be trying pretty hard for these. So it's going to be really important to understand the meta and what decks are going to be popular going into these tournaments. Whether that means that influences what deck you end up playing for the tournament, or if you're brewing, maybe this influences the build and what cards you specifically put in your deck in order to counter the top decks. I think it's really important to understand what the top decks are doing, so that way you can take this into account for whatever deck you end up bringing. So the way that I see the meta right now is that I think there's three main pillars. The first pillar is this energy conversion lab with red heroism. This is generally a aggro shell that is using the new Poe and Wrecker as really good top end. Specifically when you combine them with ambush, they are just really strong because they ambush for a really big amount that often kills leaders, and then also have other on attack or win played abilities that can kill other units. So this shell is really strong. The Cunning decks I actually have on a affiliate that's a little bit higher, and I'll kind of get into this a little bit later when I'm going over some of the decks. But Cunning is just one of the best cards in the game, where you're able to use the card Cunning as well as the other interaction in yellow to be able to really play these games where you're up on resources, up on tempo, and are able to just close up the game with really powerful interaction, pretty much. The final pillar is this whole green villain ramp package, where you're generally ramping off super laser tech and other ramp cards to go into overall barrage to help stabilize you in the mid game. And then because you've ramped, you can get into these late game cards like Darth Vader earlier than other decks can. So I'm going to go over each of these pillars and then some example decks of them. So the first one I want to cover is the Cunning decks. So these are generally going to be mono yellow. So probably the most popular one is Boba, but then Han Solo yellow has just won, I think, 2 tournaments in Baltimore this past weekend. So this could be a really popular deck going to this weekend. Both of these decks are generally playing a really strong aggro tempo game, where they are up on resources against the opponent for pretty much the whole game, where Boba gets to untap a bunch of things, Han Solo can put extra resources into play, and then they just use the Cunning interaction to be able to close out the games and tempo the opponents out. So looking at an example deck list, this is a really classic Boba yellow deck. You see how we are playing some really strong Cunning interaction with Cunning, Surprise Strike, Waylay, as well as just a lot of just really premium units, stuff like Boba Fett, Toro, 7th Fleet. And the really nice thing about the double yellow decks now is that we don't really have to play any more really bad filler cards, which is really nice. Shadows of the Galaxy gave us a lot more options for cards that we can put into our deck. So now we just have mostly just really strong on-rate cards, which is really nice. Another thing that mono yellow also gets now as well is that we have a lot more anti-control tech in the sideboard. Stuff like Bazine, Bodhi Rook, TIE Phantom. I think if your yellow hears them, you get Sparker Rebellion too, stuff like that. So we are no longer just super weak to control decks, which we kind of were in the previous set. So this is going to be a really strong meta contender, and I think I'm going to kind of get into what I think the strengths of each of these pillars are, but this is definitely something you want to consider either playing or have a plan to play against. The next pillar is this energy conversion lab with Poe and Wrecker that I was talking about. This is generally on top of an aggro shell, so this is your often classic Rebels aggro, maybe not necessarily all of the Rebels, but you're playing your Battlefront Marines, your Sabine units, often Fleet Lieutenant, K2SO, stuff like that. You're just trying to basically just curve out with really strong units that put a lot of pressure on the opponent, and then use this top end to be able to finish out the game. So if we look at an example of a deck list that's like a Sabine green, this is just a really classic deck that's pretty similar to how Sabine looked in set 1. If we just have this whole Rebel package with really good 2-drops into really good 3-drops. And then also we just have this really good top end that we have access to now, right? Poe, Wrecker, and then we finish out the game with like 4 cards I believe in, Sabine, Ping, Burn, stuff like that. This deck is just really strong, and if it curves out and their opponent stumbles, it punishes really well. So you really want to have a plan into this aggro deck, but also the Cunning aggro decks as well, where you don't want to just be hard losing to aggro if that is something that your deck is prone to do. You want to generally play decks that have some way to combat these like fast curve out aggressive starts. The final package, or pillar, I guess, is these green villain ramp type decks. And these can take a couple different forms. This is generally like we'll play out this super laser tech or resupply or some other ramp, try to stabilize with like a barrage or other removal, and then get into just really strong late game after that. So something like Kira is going to play this in like with along with blue. So you're going to be using like the blue control tools in order to help get you and stabilize you into the late game. Emperor Palpatine generally is just trying to like hard ramp to get to his late game, and he will beat the other like late game decks because of his leader ability, flip. And then Bosk is also just trying to like generally pretty hard ramp and use some early removal to get there as well. So if we look at an example deck list like with Kira, we have just a bunch of cards that just help us keep alive in the early game on top of ramp, super laser attack, resupply. We have just like removal in order to help keep us alive, the barrage of course, and then just really good late game Darth Vader, walkers, Snokes, Star Destroyers more in the sideboard. So basically the plan is just to stay alive, ramp, and then just start playing all these like crazy late game cards. So now the thing I wanted to talk about is that, kind of like I was mentioning, I think Cunning is generally a little on a higher pillar than the other two, and this is just because of how like the matchups go. Now, if you think about these decks as like 3 separate like kind of like categories of decks, you might want to think like, sometimes you might want to guess like, oh yeah, maybe it's like a rock, paper, scissors where like, deck A beats deck B and et cetera, right? But realistically what happens is, and I've kind of found in testing, is that the Cunning based decks are generally pretty favored into the like red green heroism type decks, and then you are like an even 50-50 at worst into the green villainy decks. So this is going to be a really big thing to consider when you are either choosing what deck you want to play or choosing what decks you want to beat, is that you need to consider how you are beating these Cunning decks. Because going into Gen Con, I think just with how the meta is right now, the Cunning decks really just don't have any bad matchups really, where you are favorable into like the smaller aggro decks, you are at worst 50-50 into the green control decks. So then what is beating you? And I think if somebody can find some kind of list that beats these Cunning decks pretty consistently, maybe like 60% or something like that, and then doesn't give up a ton of percentage points into other matchups, you're going to be in a pretty good spot. Because I think a lot of people are going to be on this like Boba, Han, Cunning stuff in Gen Con, because it is just going to be, it's just one of the strongest things to be doing, right? So traditionally, I think before in set 1, there was the like hard control deck that tried to like play, Super Laser Last Avenger and then Vigilance Mill to win type of thing. That was pretty strong against the yellow decks before. Now, we have gotten a lot more tools against that with more hand disruption, like Bazine and stuff like that, and TIE Phantom is really annoying for them to deal with. So there's going to be some hurdles, but I think that if there's maybe some control deck or some other deck that has a pretty good matchup into the Cunning decks, that could be a pretty good meta choice for the weekend, because I think a lot of people are going to be on it. The final thing I want to close with is, and I think this is something that people are just starting to pick up on, I think it started popping up a lot in Baltimore last week, is the whole situation around tech, specifically not just like tech and DJ. I think tech has a bunch of other utility, but tech and DJ is a pretty strong combo. If you don't know how it works, basically you play out tech first, either for like 3 resources or smuggle it out for 4. What then that lets you do is, normally you would have to smuggle DJ for like 7 plus 2 Cunning, so that's pretty hard to get to, or this is more like a late game play. However, when you have tech out, this lets you smuggle DJ for 5 actually. So that lets you go, okay, 4 resources tech, then 5 resources DJ, take the resource, and if you're playing something like Old Han, if you used Han's ability to get there, you can sacrifice their resource at the start of your next turn, and now you are still up on resources there, against them, and that's a pretty big advantage for you. So that's a pretty strong combo, and I think a lot is going to start popping up in a lot more decks. The other thing that I think that people are just starting to figure out with tech is that this card just might see play in just every mid and late game based deck going forward, where even in villainy decks, if these like late game villainy decks that might just be able to just kind of play them for 6, and if the next turn you're playing a Star Destroyer out of your resource row, that's pretty good, right? So I think a lot of people are going to be adopting tech not only just with DJ, but also just as another piece of their like late game puzzle. And I think a lot of late game decks are going to have to kind of consider how you are structuring your deck and how you're structuring your late game pieces and stuff around this card. So that's the main stuff I wanted to get into about like the meta going into Gen Con. Thanks so much for watching. Please be sure to subscribe. I'm going to be doing a lot more content, I think, as we see what the results of Gen Con are and, other tournaments on the weekend and weeks after. I think it's going to be really interesting to watch how the meta kind of unfolds after that. So yeah, be sure to subscribe for more content. Thanks.